Welcome to the Sage Women podcast, hosted by Melanie White and Dr. Nick Engera. We have real conversations with real women, health professionals, and coaches who share stories about perimenopause, menopause, and a range of women's health issues. Please subscribe so you get the latest updates every fortnight.
Hey, it's Melanie White here on the Sage Women podcast. I'm really excited to introduce Teryn Clarke today, who is a board-certified neurologist living in Orange County in the US. Teryn, welcome and thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm really interested in all the things you're doing because we have so many women asking us about brain health in midlife. They're asking things like, am I getting dementia? Am I going to get Alzheimer's disease? I've got brain fog. I'm not clear. How long is this going to last? And I know a lot of people are worried about these things and also what they can do to protect their brains. So I'd love to talk about some of those things with you today. But first of all, why brains? Like, what got you into this topic and this area?
Well, I specialized in neurology because I just found the brain so interesting in medical school. So much of it's unknown, and there just seemed so much ahead of us to learn. And so I found that exciting. And most of my private practice has been specialized in cognitive care, which ends up being a lot of patients with Alzheimer's disease. And I've always been pretty proactive in terms of lifestyle risk factors for my patients and trying to help them optimize those. But I ended up writing this book not as much based on my need as a physician or my experience, but actually more based on what I found when I was a patient. And what happened there is my dad had a heart attack in his 50s, and my mom had Alzheimer's disease diagnosed in her 60s. And so when I went to my new primary care doctor, they looked at my family history and saw that my dad had a heart attack and went through a bunch of different things, labs we were going to do and, things we were going to treat, and talked about lifestyle. And then he looked at my mother's history and said, "Oh, and your mom had Alzheimer's disease in her 60s." And that was the sum total of the approach for me and my health to managing my brain health. And to me, that's more important. I'm probably more scared of having Alzheimer's disease than I am of having a heart attack. And so I realized, for people like me who have parents with Alzheimer's disease, or also menopausal women like me who are starting to get brain fog, that I wanted to make what I do in my clinic approachable to more people, because clearly the physician I was seeing had no idea that we have a lot of control over our brain health and whether or not we're going to get Alzheimer's disease.
And that's why you've written the Brain Health Action Plan, I suppose.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's such an interesting thing because we are at the age where we're seeing parents struck down by different afflictions. We end up being carers for them. And I know a lot of women are concerned about, what if this happens to me? My dad passed of Alzheimer's 2 years ago. So I'm acutely aware of my potential risk factors there.
Yes.
And it is worrying. It is a concern. So I love that you're doing this work and also making it so accessible to people.
Oh, thank you.
And so fast forward to today, thinking about the people that you work with, what are some of the common things that they're doing or not doing that might be impacting their brain health?
Well, some of the biggest things that impact brain health are a lot of the things that our mom told us to do. Exercise has a huge role in keeping the brain healthy. And, we've known that for decades from the studies. We didn't necessarily understand how exercise was connecting to brain health, but the more we look into it, we see direct connection between actually hormones that the muscles release into the bloodstream that promote the nerve cell survival in the brain. So there's really a direct connection. And I find it's more motivating understanding exactly how well connected this system is. It helps me stay motivated to, for example, exercise. Another big one is that's preventative for Alzheimer's disease and dementia is a low sugar diet. And that, I think, is kind of a sneaky one, because I don't think that most of us are just running out and choosing to eat too much sugar on purpose, but a lot of our food has added sugar into it that's kind of sneaky, even in things that aren't particularly sweet, like crackers and bread. So, our food has kind of gotten infiltrated with sugar. And so
Yeah.
I really usually encourage my patients to read labels and be aware of some of those hidden sources of sugar, because there's a direct connection between sugar and the brain through insulin. Um, and if we're bombarding our system with spikes of sugar, even hidden in these foods, then it directly promotes toxic proteins being deposited in our brain. So that's another big one. Those are probably my top two that I work with
Yeah.
patients on the most.
Isn't it interesting that a lot of women at midlife start to think, oh, my pants are getting tight, I'm gaining weight. I should focus on losing weight. And they're thinking of insulin resistance or those sorts of things, or fat intake from that angle, not
Yes.
from the consequences to brain health.
Yes, and it's all the same process that's going on. I mean, my passion is for brain health, but it of course does pay dividends in all the other systems. I mean, eating for a healthy brain does usually or can result in weight loss if people are overweight because of insulin resistance and other eating habits and lack of exercise. One of the things that I take a little issue though with sometimes, even when we're looking at the factors that are set out by the medical institutions for dementia risk prevention, one of them is obesity. And I always look at that with a bit of caution, because to me, obesity is just a marker of many other things. Too much sugar, insulin resistance, maybe lack of sleep, maybe lack of exercise. But I always worry that people will think that the answer to that is to just lose weight. And so I don't focus on losing weight for any of my patients. If we measure anything, we measure waist circumference. And I'm in the US, so we measure it in centimeters because it feels less judgmental because we're not familiar with centimeters. So we don't measure it, which immediately we would probably have a reaction to, right?
Interesting.
But I think that's where sometimes the medical folks can get us off track, because it's not about losing weight. A lot of times when people set out to lose weight, they end up losing muscle instead. And so it's really about body composition, and probably, waist is a better marker of if there's excess weight around the abdomen, which is really where we're concerned about it.
Yeah, and even BMI is not a reliable indicator either, is it? Because you can have a
Correct.
lot of, you can be a bodybuilder and have a high BMI by virtue of the weight of your muscle mass.
Yeah, absolutely. I did have like a huge gnarly CrossFitter, and he was technically obese. I mean, his body fat percentage was probably under 10%.
Wow.
So yes, I don't use BMI. If we use anything, we use waist circumference, and we don't measure frequently.
Just wanting to dive into these sugars in food a little bit more so that people are aware of what they might be looking for. What comes to my mind is high fructose corn syrup, of course, but then there's things like maltodextrin. What else might we be looking for in foods that to avoid?
Yeah, those are good to mention, especially the maltodextrin, because sometimes things will say sugar-free and they're in fact not. That still gives you a big insulin response. Any cane sugar, molasses, although that's a little more slowly absorbed. But the high fructose corn syrup and is really the big one in most of the processed foods. And when I talk about sugars for brain health, I'm always talking about anything you can see on a label. So that by definition excludes fresh fruits, because they don't have a nutrition label and there are no added sugars. But the minute we process that into anything else, like a juice, a jam, a jelly, a Pop-Tart, a yogurt, then it has a label, and I'm looking at the added grams of sugar for that. And the way it directly connects into the brain is that when you have a processed sugar, like any of those that we just talked about, that comes into your system, you get a large spike of sugar in the bloodstream, and then the body responds with a large spike of insulin to push that sugar into the cells so it can be utilized for energy. It's not healthy for it to stay in the bloodstream. And so then insulin, after it's done its job, is floating around the bloodstream, and it has to be broken down before the body can excrete it. And it's broken down by an enzyme called insulin degrading enzyme, which sounds very straightforward. But when scientists named that enzyme, they didn't realize all the other proteins and enzymes it breaks down. And one of those other proteins is amyloid, which is one of the two toxic proteins we see in the brains of people with Alzheimer's. So if we have small not small or large, but if we have spikes of sugar coming into our system all day, we have high levels of insulin throughout the day that then need to be broken down, and it's competing with amyloid to get broken down. The insulin's smaller, so it usually wins that fight, and then
Yeah.
that amyloid that doesn't get broken down can be deposited in the brain. So that's the direct connection with sugar, and especially spikes of sugar throughout the daytime.
So that's really helpful. I can think of a few people I know that are battling with sugar at the moment, and I can see how this would be really motivating for them to not eat sugar or to not create those big insulin spikes.
Yeah, and even if you can just start trying not to start up that insulin production so early in the morning. So even just trying to clear sugar out of breakfast and push off, the first insulin spikes of the day till lunchtime, it makes a big difference if your system has a chance to rest from being exposed to insulin and a chance to break down all the other proteins it needs to break down.
Mhm. And speaking of protein, I noticed that you did mention protein intake in your book too, and this is a really hotly discussed and debated topic. How much protein should we be eating and what type? But in the context of brain health, what can you tell us about protein?
So protein is important because we make little messenger molecules that take messages from one neuron or brain cell to another one in the brain, and that's how our brain is functioning and sending messages. And so we need protein to make those messenger compounds. So that's really one of the more pressing needs of the brain for protein. And then, of course, we're constantly modeling and remodeling and rebuilding all parts of our body, and the brain is part of that process as well. So as we're remodeling and rebuilding, we need those proteins to come in. They get broken down basically into building bricks or Legos, and then they go into the brain, and then the brain reassembles them to make the proteins it needs. So those are two major reasons we need protein. And then the third that still ties into health, brain health, is maintaining muscles, especially when we're changing our diet. We don't want to start digesting our muscles for fuel source. We want to use fat and sugars for fuel source and keep our muscles strong, so that they can continue to generate those healthy hormones for brain health.
Mm. So really protein being a messenger molecule
Yes.
in one sense, and then that critical part of maintaining muscle mass. And we know that in midlife, women experience sarcopenia, and we break down muscle, and we've got to really be careful about maintaining and building, getting enough protein and enough weight-bearing exercise to keep that going.
Yeah, it's just so critical in the midlife, especially. It's really our last go at building, and trying to start with as high as we can. And because some element of muscle loss will come, we're hoping we don't hit a level that's officially sarcopenia during our lifetime. But midlife is really that last push to put on muscle, for the rest of our lives, then maintain it. It's harder. Every decade we get further along, it's harder to build. So that's the goal now.
Yeah, fantastic. Teryn, is there anything else you could share from your book that would be really helpful in terms of lifestyle habits for optimizing the brain, or approaches or processes that women can take to boost their brain health?
Well, I think there's lots of big topics like sleep and stress management, meditation, prayer, and I think those are big ones. A little one that I kind of love, and we've talked about it a bit, is the hormones that come out of the muscles that support our brain health. They're called myokines. And so one thing I might encourage your listeners to do is to take tiny exercise breaks and get those muscles moving and get them to release those myokines. And the best way to think about it is breaking up the sedentary. When we look at people, it's really that sedentariness when the muscles basically go to sleep and they stop excreting. So if you're somebody who's sitting at a desk a lot of the day, like I am, it's really beneficial whenever you have a chance. If it can be every half an hour, that would be lovely, to get up and do, whatever quick exercises you can do in your space. So for me, I like to do squats. partly because the quads and hamstrings are big muscle groups. So I'm getting a lot of myokine release for the time I have. And then I also don't have to get dirty by getting on the ground. Or modified push-ups on a desk or the kitchen counter. But that's one little hack that I like. We've looked at studies, and people who do 2 minutes of exercise every half an hour throughout the day, it's the same as going to the gym for an hour. So if you don't have time to go to the gym for an hour, you don't like to go to the gym for an hour, which is also possible. If you can squeeze in little bits of it, if you're taking the laundry upstairs, walk the stairs up and down 3 or 4 times and then do your laundry. Just building in extra little bits here and there, they actually do make a difference.
And you do talk about habits and habit stacking in your book, don't you?
Yes, and I always talk about starting small. So the book really should meet people wherever they are. If they already exercise, they can find themselves in the habits. If they don't at all, we can start small. It can be 1 push-up a day. It can be 1 squat. It can be walking a minute. I know people can do this. And so many people have a challenging time because they want to go from 0 to 60. But we just need to do a little bit every day, and those habits will start to pile on top of themselves and bring us great brain health.
Yeah, I like to keep drinking a lot of water because then I have to get up and go to the toilet. And if I climb the stairs to go to the toilet upstairs, then that keeps me on that cycle of getting up and off the desk, because it can be so easy to become fixated, even to ignore alarms or calendar reminders that pop up.
Yes.
So we actually
setting a
need
body
something...
alarm, like having to go to the bathroom, is the best one. You can't ignore it.
Exactly.
And water is so important. I mean, people will sleep better if they're drinking adequate water. We really, by midlife, are running around dehydrated most of the time because our thirst sensor is not what it was.
Yeah.
People just feel so much better hydrating, and probably what they might think is overhydrating, but probably it's actually just what their body needs. Half a gallon a day for sure. And that's quite a bit of water.
And I guess that's the other thing too, is when you're hungry, thirsty, it can often be disguised as hunger, right? You can...
Absolutely. Yes, I do talk in the book about intermittent fasting and trying to stretch, the hours between the last meal of the day and the first meal of the day. And that was something I wasn't doing consistently before I wrote the book. And then when we started looking at all the data, I have to do this. And so I tried it, and I did find exactly that at first, when I was feeling hungry, I thought in the morning, I would just have a full glass of water, and it almost always went away. Like, I did find exactly what you're saying, that most of the time I think I'm hungry, I'm actually thirsty. So yeah, it's funny how those wires get a little crossed.
Yeah, we've really got to learn to tune into our bodies a bit and pay attention, don't we? There's so many signals that we can get for various things that we need to be aware of. And actually that, we're jumping around a bit, but I'm thinking now of sleep too, because sleep is one of those things that if you don't get enough sleep, you tend to have cravings, you're grumpy, you're tired, you're looking for food, or you're less likely to exercise. And all of those are probably relevant for brain health. Well, they are, but what else is there about sleep that we need to know about in the context of brain health and staving off dementia and Alzheimer's?
Yes, it's really interesting. The new science is showing that when we are in deep sleep, the brain cells actually dehydrate a bit and shrink, and that allows for more space around the brain in the water areas. And so during that time, there's actually a detoxifying process that happens and removes some of the proteins that were deposited during the day, proteins like amyloid and tau. And so, we know if we don't sleep well one night, the next morning we don't feel sharp. We probably wouldn't work on taxes or something complex. But this constant insomnia and lack of deep sleep can lead to more toxins building up in the brain. So that's a really important direct connection between sleep and brain health. And one of the things I find it's difficult being a middle-aged woman and talking to middle-aged women is that we're all starting to have a different sleep pattern, or most of us, I should say, are starting to break up our sleep cycles a little bit. A lot of awakenings at 2 or 3 a.m., maybe sweating, a bunch of different reasons. But I actually started wearing one of the tracking rings where I could measure my sleep cycles. And I had heard a sleep specialist I know was giving a talk, and she said, don't wear those. They cause so much anxiety. I actually found the exact opposite for me. I found that when I started tracking that I had adequate deep sleep, because most of that happens in the first half of the night. So by the time I was waking up at 2 or 3 in the morning, I actually had adequate deep sleep, which is where I get the cleaning mechanism.
Yeah.
And then the second half of the night's where you get REM sleep. So it changed my attitude of being up at night. I used to be up at 2 and I would be frankly mad at myself that I was awake. And then I would just start going in circles that I was so frustrated I couldn't get back to sleep. So now I appreciate that as more of a quiet time where I can think. There's no intrusion in the world. I actually have some really great clarity of thought. And then I do get back to sleep. But it was kind of that reassurance that, it's not the end of the world. Even if you're up for an hour in the middle of the night, you may be getting adequate sleep. So taking some of the stress out of that awakening, I found was very helpful.
Yeah, that is an issue, isn't it? That the whole idea of pre-sleep arousal and the anxiety around, will I sleep? How much will I get? Will I get enough?
Yes, it does
Actually,
feed on itself, doesn't it?
yeah. So that's great to know that getting that first part of the night really solid is important. Is there anything we can do to achieve that, or to increase the likelihood of sleeping well in that first part of the night?
Yeah, most of what will help that first half of the night of sleep are in the realm of sleep hygiene. So trying to cut down looking at any screens for an hour or two before bedtime, trying to separate bedtime from the last meal of the day by about 3 hours so your digestive tract has really settled down, abstaining from alcohol for 1 to 2 hours. And then some people may need additional cues to tell their body that it's time to go to sleep. A warm bath at night. Sometimes reading is really helpful for people, but reading a book, not on a device.
Yeah.
Those types of things. Meditation is really beneficial for getting to sleep in the first place, but then also in a nighttime awakening to eventually settle your mind down again and get back to sleep. So those are some pretty good ways to set a good course for sleep.
Right. Thank you, Teryn. And one other thing I'd like to ask about briefly is alcohol, because I know that our tolerance to alcohol changes, our liver changes during this stage of life. Alcohol is also dehydrating. So I'm thinking about what you said earlier with keeping the brain hydrated. What's your thoughts about alcohol and brain
So
health?
alcohol, I've really made a shift over the last 3 to 5 years. We used to think that the healthy amount of alcohol for the brain was 2 drinks daily, and that less than that was not as healthy, and more than that was not as healthy. And most of that research came out of France, so it's not that surprising. Most of that was geared towards wine.
Yeah.
But there's been larger population-based studies more recently that have released data, and those are very clearly showing that less than 2 drinks a day are better than 2 drinks a day. And probably anywhere where you are, if you decrease, that will be more healthy for the brain than a current level. That really there's no level of decrease that isn't more healthy. So, and for a lot of reasons. So partly because the alcohol molecule is neurotoxic, meaning it's toxic to brain cells. Of course, that's a bit dose related as well. But also for the dehydration factor. We might think we're sleeping better after drinking, but we aren't. It's more of a shallow sleep that's not as effective. So in general, I would encourage people to cut down drinking or use spacers when they can to limit use, or limit to just weekends. Have some wherever people are to try to cut down a bit.
It's interesting that you mentioned shallow sleep there too, and we talked earlier about the essentiality of that deep sleep.
Yes.
So,
Yes. Yeah. It's just not the sleep with alcohol on board is not as efficient.
Wow, so many amazing nuggets of information in this chat today, Teryn. Thank you so much for being here today. We'd love to share a link to your book in the show notes for this episode. Is there any last insight that you'd like to share with people who are concerned about their brain health in midlife or want to make some changes?
Yeah, I would just let them know that Up to 50% of Alzheimer's disease risk factors are modifiable. So they have a lot more control over whether or not they're going to get Alzheimer's disease or dementia than they might think. And the time to make those changes is really in midlife.
The time is now.
Yes, it is.
Thank you so much, Teryn. Really appreciate you being here today.
Thanks for having me. Have a great day.
You too.